So I'm excited. So just to kind of take you through a basic list of what the agenda is on this talk, who I am, why all passwords are crap, all of them, and then I'm going to give, because it's like a very diverse audience, so I want to give like a bit of a relevant primer on applied cryptography, because even people that you talk to say, yeah, I know crypto, when you go to talk to them about certain aspects, it turns out they start to get lost, so I just kind of want to go over the things that are most important there, and then discuss data breaches and how they're not disclosed properly. And the real meat of it is I'm going to get to a case study where there was a big breach last year, over 1 million user accounts stolen that was leaked online, and I had my way with it, and so those results will be interesting. So who am I? Lucas Zaichkowsky, been in the IT industry since the mid-90s. Sysadmin, netadmin, telecommunications. Gave that up because I got tired of fixing broken shit and ended up working at a credit card processor where suddenly PCI became a big deal. And, you know, that was a lot better than IT. So I got to work, and it was an interesting experience. Got to work with a lot of point-of-sale developers who were still coding in VB6, and they thought encrypting things meant doing like ROT13 and obfuscating or having their own little secret algorithm. Went on from there to Mandiant, where I got to see some really scary crap that kept me up at night for about 6 or 7 months. And it really changed the way I think about everything, including attacks and breaches and threats. And you'll see where I'm going with that. So all passwords are crap. Why is that? Well, first off, go back to the premise of what are threats? Threats are people. I mean, they really are. There's no such thing anymore as a self-replicating virus. No one writes a virus that just goes around self-replicating. Malware, as it is a tool that's used to achieve something. And whether it's crap or being used to steal passwords, it's a means to an end. So, you know, going with the intelligence-driven defense model, kill chain analysis, you got to look at it as from a threat actor perspective and know who your adversaries are. Now, if you look at the nuisance junk that's out there, your day-to-day spam and Z-bot type crap, you know, not such a big deal there. But you start going into hacktivism with the script kiddies and work your way up to insider threats, cyber criminals, state-sponsored espionage. It starts to get more and more sophisticated. How many of you are familiar with things like DLL load order hijacking? Show of hands. Okay. How many of you think that it's just really an academic world thing? Show of hands. Okay, it's changed a lot. Yeah, they've been doing that for a long time now, both state-sponsored as well as financially motivated. So why is this relevant to the password thing? Because attackers want to be inside you. They really do. And looking over the anatomy of an attack, and this is just kind of one example of an attack life cycle, there's always that initial point of entry. So first they start doing some vulnerability scanning. And then once they find something, maybe they start doing some Google hacking and find web pages that they know are outdated, that have SQL injection flaws, and now they're on that web server. Or, you know, heck, they could always phish your users and get straight in that way. There's a billion ways to get that victim zero, which I think we all know there's no way to stop it. There's always going to be a victim zero. But the interesting thing is they start popping web shells and doing lateral movement. So they'll break out of that DMZ, going from one host to the next. And then they start doing RDP sessions. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this is the point where they've got legitimate user credentials and they're using RDP just like a user would to get from system to system. They start doing SMB sessions, SQL sessions. I mean, there's no malware necessarily at this point except maybe the back doors they leave behind. It's a lot of user activity. And so this is why those passwords are so important. And then they just pivot, get to what they're after, set up a pipeline that basically gets from A to Z. I'm not Canadian, but I just like saying Z. And then they just siphon everything out, and there goes your goodies. And I've seen a lot of attacks across the board, and it's the same thing over and over again. All the cool things that you read about in the news, they're cool and all, but they're not paid for cool factor. They're paid to produce results, and they haven't changed much except maybe getting stealthier and stealthier on an as-needed basis. So how many of you are familiar with like the APT1 report? Show of hands. Okay. So consider that like the tier 1 hackers for the PLA, where, yeah, it works against 90% of the companies out there. They're not extremely sophisticated, but it's enough to get the job done. And they're operationally sophisticated. They have SOPs, escalation procedures, and so on. But you start getting to groups like, I'm not going to name them, but there's other groups where they'll create different backdoors, password dumping tools, anything they need, new variants. Every time they land on a different system, they never use C2 infrastructure, and every time they're done with the system, they'll delete their tools and defrag on their way out just to piss off investigators. So it's interesting. Now, you look at these incidents post-mortem, or even just looking at our environments today, and I think we can all agree password reuse is a huge problem. Users reuse their passwords on multiple sites. Maybe they have little clever mechanisms that's different from site to site. For a robot that might work, but for a human, if your password is a certain set of characters in the first 3 digits of the domain name, a human's going to figure that out pretty quick. And then you have things like service accounts, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a really difficult problem to solve because it's a human problem. Password management isn't accessible to most people, and so until that's changed, it's going to continue to be a problem. And even if it is addressed, like I myself use a password management tool, generate unique random character passwords for every account, but if a site gets hacked and they haven't done things properly, that password's toast, right? And that's kind of where we get to is you've seen in the news a lot of websites getting hacked for their user databases. And yeah, there's phishing schemes that can go on from that, or intelligence analysis that can be done by foreign agencies. But another big problem is those passwords are a huge liability. And so let's go ahead and jump into why that can become a liability. So why hash? I apologize if you know crypto inside and out, but for those of you that don't, this is very important to know. You don't want to encrypt passwords, because if you encrypt it, you can decrypt it. It's a lot better to just do like a fingerprint of the password when the user creates their password, and you can't create a person from a fingerprint, right? But when someone goes and puts their finger against it again, you can still compare the fingerprint. So it's the same idea with the hash. So for the password purpose, there's that. And then from a file perspective or larger binaries, it's being able to verify integrity. So if you download something, you can compare the hash against the calculated value, make sure it wasn't tampered with, SMIME for digital identification on email, and so on and so on. Now, a little public service announcement. I keep hearing MD5 is broken, and in a sense it is, but it's only from the sense of collisions. So if you have large binaries, there's weaknesses that allow you to go searching for other variants of another binary that would produce that same hash. That's basically the weakness. But if you have a password, you'd have to have a really, really, really long password to start running into collision scenarios, at which point you might as well just brute force the password anyway or whatever. So for password uses, MD5 is still good. Now, Keyspace is essentially taking a look at all the available characters for that password, along with minimum, maximum characters allowed, and then being able to compute how many possible combinations are there to this lock. And of course, bigger is better. Larger key space, the more time it's going to take from a brute forcing perspective. Now, when you're looking at calculations for like median time to brute force crack passwords, you always want to go off of the 50%. So you look at how long to get through the entire key space, and then just basically chop that in half, and that's a baseline to go by. Now, SALT. SALT is essentially, how many of you have heard of rainbow tables? Okay, everyone's heard of rainbow tables. Basic idea there is you can pre-compute hashes for your passwords or your dictionary files, and then just do a lookup like it's a SQL database instead of brute force cracking things. So the idea behind SALT is for every time a password gets created and put into your user database, you want to generate random data to append to that. That way it's unique on every instance. If 15 people in your user database have the same password, the hash is going to be different. And why is that important? You can't pre-compute tables. You have to basically go through the CPU or GPU or APU cycles to do the brute forcing at that point. It forces them to go down the more time-consuming and expensive path. Now, rounds. This is an important point that often gets missed. Even if you're salting, you can still breeze through those things pretty fast, but you start doing things like rehashing the hash a couple thousand times, that's going to slow down brute forcing tremendously. Typical scenario is 2,000 rounds, so that slows it down by 2,000ths. So a lot slower. Now, it pisses off the attackers. The good news is it doesn't really slow down your production system impact. So, no really bad side effects from that. Now, getting to the implementation failures. Now that you've had the primer, this is where you really start to see programmers F up all the time. Passwords, they're stored in plain text, obfuscated, they're a ROT13 scheme. Even if they're storing it encrypted, the key is usually really easy to get. You can just look at their code or wherever it's pulling from, pull it out of memory. There's a billion ways to go after keys. So encryption, bad. Storing in plain text, bad. Or salt isn't used. So again, you can start doing the rainbow tables, and it makes it a lot faster. If you have a large database of users, say 1 million user accounts, if you have same passwords that are very common, you don't have to crack them multiple times, so to speak. And then password complexity being hindered. How many of you use password management tools to create random passwords? Okay, fair amount. How pissed do you get when you go to put a password at a site? I'm already seeing the hands, right? It's like, this character is not allowed. Or it allows it, and then you can't log in because the programmer didn't use the same library or something. Like what? Tick? Yeah, like the tick character, right? Because they're trying to do input validation in one spot. You're like, well, it looks like they're not doing input validation everywhere, which is interesting. Password length is known. That obviously decreases the key space a lot. So if for some reason it's showing the number of characters in a password, that just significantly reduces the key space because you know it's exactly that number. It's not going to be 6, 7 characters, 9, 10 characters. It's going to be exactly 8. Or not rate limiting authentication, even though it's not a user database problem. It's more of a implementation of validating the users. So remember the iCloud accounts getting hacked and all the celebrity nudes appearing? How many of you remember celebrity nudes? Everyone? Yay? Okay. So that was basically one of the API methods available for validating the iTunes accounts. They weren't rate limiting, whereas the rest of them they were. You see that happen all the time. And then, of course, there's just stupid logic flaws, insecure coding to just bypass authentication altogether. So all the time. Now, looking at user database breaches and how they've been happening and how they've been disclosed, it's a complete joke, and it's a liability. I'm surprised companies aren't getting sued the way they're disclosing or lack of disclosing. So you commonly see phrases as no payment card data, personally identifiable information, or personal healthcare information was stolen. They're basically saying what wasn't stolen that they're legally obliged to divulge. That's all they're doing. The lawyers are telling them what to say. Or passwords were protected but not stored in the clear. It's like, so what exactly does that mean, protected? Because, again, depending on whether it's salted, how many rounds, was it encrypted, was it hashed, there's a lot of important questions to identify the risk that's imposed by that database theft. And then also, no one ever seems to bother to ask these companies, do you know if the attackers modified your code to steal passwords as users are authenticating? I never see that get asked by reporters. And then last, they'll say all users are being forced to create new passwords as a precaution. So like Zappos. Okay, great. So they're not going to get your shoes, but guess what? If you're reusing your password, they're in your email. They're resetting passwords for your other accounts. If you use the same password at work, your work's now an issue. That's part of what triggered this talk to begin with, is the idea that people reusing passwords not only affects their personal accounts, it's also a good way for attackers who are getting into enterprise environments for more insidious means or more reasons. So yeah, looking at Zappos, here's some direct quotes. The database that stores our customers' critical cards and other payment data was not affected or accessed. And that was literally in bold. Like they wanted to make sure that you knew that right up front. And then they're letting you know that information was accessed, yada, yada, and your cryptographically scrambled password, but not your actual password. And I actually hit up the CTO and several other key individuals asking, hey, I'm in the security space. I just want to know what kind of risks there are, so as I'm talking to clients and whatnot, I could advise them on the impact. 0 response, which probably isn't good if you think about it. Now, cracking user databases. This is where it starts to become a lot of fun. So a lot of it's about efficiency because it takes time and we're very impatient and we want to get it done quickly. So if there's no salt, obviously, start just downloading rainbow tables, generate your own. There's websites where you can just type in or upload things, and they already have the pre-computed tables. Hit that up first. And so if you have a database with, let's say, 1 million user accounts, you can immediately start decreasing it by a certain amount. And then from there, you go to your word list. How many of you are familiar with word lists, dictionary files? Okay, a fair amount. So you start hitting that up and look for the one-to-one matches. You decrease it further. And it's basically going by what's going to give you the most ROI. And then you go down from there. Identify pattern and length distribution. So a good strategy is I've already gotten the things that were directly on the word list. I analyze it and I see the largest distribution is on 9-character passwords, and then 7, and then 11, or whatever. And so you can start going for those specific lengths as a way to do it efficiently. And that's where you really start to get into brute force territory. And rules. How many of you are familiar with rules? Okay, less hands. So you got your word list with, let's say it's just a dictionary file of the English word dictionary, or a foreign language if it's some other country's website. So the idea is they have these rules that do things like add digits to the end, special characters at the beginning, make incremental changes, and there's even contests that are done. OCL Hashcat, anyone? So I'm not sure if it was them that did it or someone else, but there was a contest for the best 64 rules, and so it's literally called Best 64, and it is baller. I love it. You can get really good results where you do your word list, then you run the Best 64, and it just gives you these huge, huge additional cracked passwords. So when I first started approaching this project of cracking this database that I'm going to get to, it was very computationally expensive. And so I went back to the drawing board on word lists, and I thought, what would be the best word list possible? I don't think a dictionary file is really the one. How about a list of already cracked passwords, because people reuse passwords? And so if you go to this website that's up there, it's like this group effort of people cracking these databases, and you can download already cracked passwords. It doesn't have the associated user accounts with them, and that's fine. I just want passwords that are actually real passwords that have been used. So I downloaded all of these, merged them all, deduped them, and then ran them through the tool SplitLane, which is also available through OCL Hashcat, which separates it into separate files for like 1-character passwords. Surprisingly, there were a few of those, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And the reason for that is when you're using GPUs to crack, it's very efficient to use the same length for your word list. So use all 8-character passwords and pipe it through, then do all 9, pipe it through, 10, and so on. And so then I set about building the rig. And I got a lot of funny looks when I showed this on Twitter, I think, and a few other places. Are you Bitcoin mining? It's like, no, although that may be a good way to recover some of the costs of this rig. So I got a used Gigabyte motherboard for $84, a Sempron CPU off eBay for $22. I mean, you really don't need much. I grabbed like an ancient 2.5-inch hard drive, which in retrospect just wasted a lot of my time installing operating system. I should have spent the money and got something faster. The real bulk of the cost was the 6 GTX 750 Ti cards. How many of you are familiar with the Haswell chipset and how that helps? So with NVIDIA, they added a new instruction set that makes it incredibly faster to crack things, and it also is really low energy consumption. So when I'm running these 6 cards, I'm using $1.44 a day of electricity. It's not generating much heat. It's freaking beautiful. And fun story, I left this at home in Colorado, went to upstate New York for Christmas, and one day it stopped responding, and I went, oh man, I bet that tape fell apart. And yeah, 2 of the cards fell on the motherboard, fried it. I had to do some RMAs, and long story short, I just sat on it for 6 months and finally did that. So looking at the performance, so those of you wondering, what do you get out of 6 cards? About $1,000 investment there. If you're going after NTLM passwords, 45 billion hashes a second. MD5, 22 billion. I mean, really, this is going, in order of the fastest to slowest in terms of going through Keyspace. The one that I'm going to be focusing on in a bit here is the PH pass, which was doing 6 million hashes a second, because that has well, I'll show you. OS X, pretty impressive. They've got to be doing some crazy stuff to make it computationally expensive. This is the database I went after. How many of you remember this database leak? Okay. Now, what I really wanted to do, again, was I said when I set out on this project, I wanted to think of it from a corporate perspective and what it means to organizations. So I thought, well, let's go to the DHS list of critical infrastructure segments and a few other interesting things and go after that. So, looking at how the user database was structured, PHPass, it generates salt, then it hashes the salt with password, and then it repeats it iteratively 8,192 times. So remember, 6 million hashes a second in performance, but that's with a really impressive cracking rate. And sure, you could do this out in the cloud on Amazon or whatever, but I thought it was way more fun to put together milk crates. It was literally just I wanted to have fun. Now, after 2 to 3 days, this is the part that even surprised me. After 2 to 3 days, just using the word list that I merged together, here's what I was able to accomplish. Chemical industry, 34 cracked accounts, 83 uncracked. Communications, 135 cracked, 316 not cracked. Defense industry, and this is, by the way, top 10 companies in each of these verticals, major organizations, publicly traded. So defense, 54 cracked, 140 not cracked. Energy, 29 and 69. Finance, I mean, you see I'm not going to read off the whole freaking slide, but every vertical was affected. And there wasn't really that major of a variance from one industry to the next. I mean, IT, I guess, fared the best, but even that's pretty sad. There's people in IT that, whatever. Now, a lot of people would think, and correctly think, well, yeah, there's probably a lot of trash passwords in there, throwaway passwords. And there is, but don't think I didn't go through that list just looking for funny passwords and whatever else. I was really shocked. There were really long, complex passphrases that wouldn't have been hit by base 64. I mean, obviously it was hit by this word list, that there's no chance it was a collision of one user choosing the same passphrase or random characters as another user. It was one of those databases that was cracked, that they're still using that same password, not knowing that password is compromised. Now, I also went after .gov. Hopefully that doesn't piss off too many people. 234 cracked passwords and 373. That was using the word list and the best 64 rule. Now, the reason I went with best 64 first is I found an Ars Technica article, frankly, that showed someone else's results using these different rule sets. So after that, you'd probably want to go on to the dead one rule and so on and so on. But the real important thing to remember here is if you wanted to get into an organization, you really just need one user account that works. And I have a lot here to go off of. And even if they change it one character here or there, it's pretty close. You could probably get into an account or two or more. And once you're in as that user, just think, any user in your environment, if you can log in as them and be a complete asshole, you could do a lot of damage, and that's a scary thing. So using the rules on the data set, again, what I did was I just looked at the distribution of the password length, and on this particular set, 8-character passwords were dominant, and that's what I did first. Now, going after the top 10 verticals, I mean, I was looking at, I think, 4,000 accounts total, and after doing the straight word list, it was down to, 2,124. That's going to take some time. I'm still letting it run right now in the background, but at 6% completion on just the 8 characters, I've got a 39 additional. Now I go to do the 7 characters, the 9 characters, the 10 characters, or I build a couple more of these rigs, or I go ahead and stand up a Amazon AWS instance or something. You can imagine I'd be able to get a lot further. How am I looking on time? I might actually be running really early here. Yeah, so I'm not going to use up the full hour, sorry. Takeaways and resources. How many of you remember this quote by that former director of at the NSA? It's basically, no such thing as secure anymore. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Idea is, we got to operate on the assumption that our networks are already breached, that there are threat actors getting in our environment and act appropriately. A couple days ago, I was in Denver, and I was doing a panel talk with a bunch of CISOs, and they're saying, if you want these guys to take away one thing, what would it be? And I brought up the question, if you really want to do damage, logging in as yourself and just trash everything or give away intellectual property, how bad could it be? And everyone raised their hand and said it could be really bad. And I go, okay, that's how hackers work. They are going to get your account and they can do what you can do, only better and scarier. And so what we really need to do is focus on, and this is a paper that I published recently, the Rapid Detection Response Model. You can download it at resolution1security.com. It's completely vendor neutral. I wanted it to have integrity. So it walks you through identifying your current processes on threat detection and response from that whole intelligence-driven defense model. Preparing, so basically knowing where your weaknesses are and prioritizing improving your defenses on both visibility, technology, and procedures for when you do detect things. And then it gives you a lot of primer information on threat detection response, being able to take the outcome of that and pipe it back in. So I highly recommend, and if you have feedback, I'd love to get it. I still haven't gotten any. Except the FSI SAC, they ended up sending it out to the entire list of people, so somebody liked it, I guess. So, what do I recommend doing is definitely following that model, same thing. Think of it in terms of a threat actor and how you would approach that threat actor. So for yourself, keep using password management tools. That way when Zappos gets hit, nothing else is affected. But know that your users are not going to do that and that they are compromised right now. Their passwords are stolen. And so you need to be thinking of it in terms of almost an insider threat perspective. So enforce two-factor authentication everywhere, first and foremost. Just try to block off entrance ways. And how many of you have two-factor everywhere? There's nowhere you can get into your environment with single-factor. 1, 2 hands. How positive are you? Not very positive. 99.5. So I start bringing up things like web-based email access, mobile phones accessing, third parties that have access to your environment. There's social media accounts that aren't even under your control. I mean, hell, Hootsuite, for example. So you got your marketing department that's using Hootsuite, and they support two-factor authentication. But I actually pulled the slide out because they fixed it. Up until recently, you could use the mobile app and bypass it. They just didn't have two-factor authentication implemented on the mobile app. That changed, though. So don't always assume it. And then use a jump box where you can't implement two-factor authentication. So stand up a box where you have to do two-factor authentication to get to it. And then from there, you access these other resources that you can't protect. And then regardless, start making sure you're auditing user account, not just authentication failure, but success and all the actions they're taking. And also think in terms of that attack, or remember the attack lifecycle where they're pivoting from environment to environment. You need to be able to identify all of that and reconstruct it and understand all the backdoors they planted, all the passwords they've stolen along the way so that you can properly remediate. Looking at past breaches, remember Heartland when they were breached? Yeah? So how many of you remember them talking about having a SQL breach a couple months prior to the card data breach? No? Okay, so they did talk about that, and I always suspected that they were related, but it wasn't until, I want to say about a year ago, they were interviewing Bob Carr on a podcast, and he actually said on the podcast, yeah, when that SQL breach happened, we thought we had remediated. Turns out we failed at remediation. So the attacker still had other points of entry they made available, went silent, and waited. There was one financial organization that I worked with that lost millions of dollars out of their ATM machines, spent upwards of $1 million on remediation efforts. First remediation failed. Turns out they had an entire segment of their network that was undocumented, and the attacker still had backdoors there. So it's very vital that you are able to reconstruct everything that happened. So monitor user account activity, please. And that's it. If you want to download the presentation and scare the crap out of your bosses, j.mp/pwnightmare. And I'll open it up. Questions? So the question is, what would the price comparison be between building your own cracking rig versus a cloud type of solution? I don't know. Not afraid to say it. Any other questions? Feel free to shout it or come on up. Yeah.
So I'm just curious in terms of the password that you've cracked, whether you've been able to apply that to doing any WPA2 pre-shared key cracking, whether you can apply those same, or whether you've even tried. You know, if someone gives you a PCAP and you're like, okay, we want to calculate what the pre-shared key may be, can you take these databases and apply them?
So yeah, when it comes to cracking WPA, you know, do a PCAP and get the shared secret and go after all the possible combinations, absolutely, same concept could be applied there. What I find more effective, though, is find the access points that still have the PIN mode enabled, and then you can crack them through that pretty quickly. That's a much better way to get around it. But yeah, if that's disabled, you can still brute force the keys for WPA2, pre-shared key. Any other questions?
For the speeds, how many have you gone for bcrypt? Sorry.
For the yeah. So for the speeds, the question was bcrypt. Now, when you use OCL hashcat, there's a command which just does benchmark testing, and I did see it stream by, but I didn't want to have a slide with all 100 different types of things that you could crack, so I don't know off the top of my head. Shoot me an email, and I'll just do or we can talk afterwards. I'll just remote control my system and run the command. Any other questions? The least privilege mode. So the concept of least privilege access. Definitely apply that everywhere because good example is Morgan Stanley. How did that guy get so many freaking supposedly get so many account information? Or well, it was AT&T, one of their vendors, ended up getting a lot of the information that was needed to unlock phones. And how was he able to query that many things? So it's just, again, assuming you have an insider threat, so limit the amount of access that they have to what's needed. It's just going back to the hierarchy of needs of security essentials, segmenting your networks and so on. Any other questions?
Can you give more concrete suggestions than use two-factor?
So concrete suggestions about using two-factor. So definitely like the key dongles, those are good. If you're doing it on a budget, getting it as an SMS text message. Another possible solution, like how many of you are familiar with Logman? So they have a partnership. Hello? There. Yeah, they have a partnership with Phone Factor for that, and you got to pay extra. Instead, what you do is you can have the second factor go to an email address, so you can put in your phone number at vtext.com or whatever the email to phone number format is. And yeah, someone could technically get into like your Verizon account and get your text messages through that, but the barrier to entry is a lot higher that way, at least. I really wish there was cheap and accessible two-factor authentication, to be honest. Google Authenticator, I wish everyone used that. I mean, Microsoft does it. Come on, why can't other people? Anything else? All right, well, thank you all for your time. Free you up. You got some minutes for a smoke break or whatever. And if you want to chat with me after, I'll just be right here.